What does it take to become one of the world's best? Sure, folks like Tom Brady and Max Verstappen provide you a plethora of platitudes. Practice makes perfect, discipline, hard work, and focus. For some, the story does end there with those tropes. However, for a select few, this approach is bounded. Deficient natural ability, restricted resources, whatever it may be, by sticking to the basics, they'd have been left behind. So what does the human mind do when presented with an insurmountable task? Some give up. Some change the task itself. Others, however, folks like the focus of our story, they repress the minds of the weak and exploit their way to the top. The morning air is crisp, a cold only conceptualized by the masochist amongst us that call the Midwest home. It's February in Michigan, a new face has been graced to a blue-collar family striving to make it big in the Motor City. Not long after arriving home from the hospital, our protagonist's father dons his coat and heads to work. A sacrifice of time that will become all too familiar to this young child over the coming decades. In a moment like this, time stands still for some. For others, it's a never-ending reminder of what they have yet to prove and yet to accomplish. Welcome to Rochester Hills, Michigan, and the origin of NASCAR's greatest psychological mastermind, Brad Keselowski. Brad was born midway through the American dream. His father's family, immigrants from Poland, had moved to the Americas to survive, to thrive, to dream. And that's exactly what Brad's father, Bob, was doing. Dreaming. Dreaming of giving his family financial success and joining motorsports immortality as one of the few who thrive driving race cars. You see, unlike other motorsport series like IMSA, the WEC, or F1, NASCAR was accessible to the everyman. Go down to your local dealer, buy a car, take it back to your garage, modify it, and start your dreams of glory. And Bob's father John had done just that. And much like the dreamers who dare steal ancient native treasures, John had put a generational curse on his bloodline. The curse of speed. While John hadn't achieved much success in his efforts, he had inspired a young Bob to pursue in his father's footsteps and finish what he couldn't. By the time our story's protagonist, Brad, had come along, Bob was laying the groundwork to his empire. K Automotive Racing was Bob's answer to fueling his ever-growing dependencies. For Brad, however, this was all backdrop to an impressionable mind. For Brad, the race shop was a playground, making a mud pit out of the grass field outside of Bob's legacy. A wide-eyed child's imitation of his heroes, but to Bob, it was just another reminder of what was at stake. One crash, one financial misstep, one moment of hubris, and that child's dream would be dashed. Years go by, and the seeds Bob had painstakingly sown into the rocky soil were beginning to sprout, and K Automotive was becoming successful. By 1989, Bob had won the ARCA Supercar Series Championship, and come 1995, his work would be rewarded. You see, NASCAR just created a brand new division that would tour the nation, racing V8-powered stock cars from short tracks to superspeedways. So how is this any different than NASCAR's other racing divisions? Well, they'd be racing pickup trucks. Seeking to capitalize on a growing market trend, NASCAR implemented a pickup truck racing division, hoping manufacturer interest would be strong and fan alignment would increase. For Bob, however, it was a lifeline. You see, K Automotive was one of the few race teams who based themselves away from NASCAR's Silicon Valley, Charlotte, North Carolina. All the talent, all the resources, and all the sponsors, they were centered in Charlotte. So when Chrysler went hunting for a team to run their new Mopar-sponsored vehicles in this Craftsman Truck Series, they stumbled into a sleepy ARCA team right in their backyard. And despite what it might have appeared based on its on-track success, K Automotive was not the financial breadwinner Bob would have hoped it to be. There's an old phrase in motorsports: how do you make $1 million racing? Start with 2. K's successes had run the company's profits thin, so when an opportunity to be sponsored by the Chrysler Automotive Group came to the table, Bob gave it everything his Michigan heart could muster. Finding that heart, Chrysler cut a deal, and for the 1995 season, K would become Chrysler's factory truck team. 2 years later, and Bob would stand on top of the world. K Automotive, his legacy had put him in victory lane at Richmond Raceway for the first time. Meanwhile, back home, our young protagonist, Brad, was watching from the television, future becoming clear. His dream of racing in NASCAR was going to become a reality. Fast forward to 2000, and Bob has stepped aside from driving duties and handed that honor to Dennis Setzer. Sensing the writing on the wall, Bob has chosen the betterment of K Automotive over his own dreams. All his chips were in, and K was now the only thing that lay between himself and ruin. Now 1 year later, and K has dealt its biggest blow to date. Chrysler, Bob's lifeline, was pulling funding and moving their support elsewhere. Scrambling, K cobbled together a deal with Ford, and by the end of 2002, the team had won 4 races, 3 poles, with Terry Cook behind the wheel of an F-150. Things seemed great, and Brad's path to NASCAR success still remained ever clear.
Hey, boys, that's Craftsman truck racing.
Ah, the beautiful sight of Daytona in February. A new NASCAR season is upon us, and the young star is ready to rock. By the end of 2004, K Automotive was ready to wager his future on the shoulders of its heir. Brad had proven himself a capable driver in the eyes of his father, but now it's time for the NASCAR loyalists to see what he was made of. Starting the season with a bang, Brad scored his first top 10 with a 7th place run in the season opening race in Daytona. With runs like that, it seemed that for Brad and for Kay, the worst was finally behind them. You know, sometimes I'll spend entire days in an almost dreamlike daze, sort of stumbling around in the dark of my mind, entranced by inaction. The idea that all of your work is for nothing more than a paycheck, that you'll never amount to anything, that you'll never build anything. I'm not sure if it's a guy thing or the result of trauma, but I crave something that'll last, something to hand off, something to, well, be proud of. For the Keselowskis, that empire, seeded by dreamer immigrants, was in the hands of its youngest, and it all came crumbling down around him. Those big-time sponsors had moved along, and the price of running a competitive race team continued to spiral. Brad had tried everything he could to keep Kay afloat, in a desperate plea that he might still have a chance, that the Keselowskis' namesake wouldn't be so easily forgotten. For Brad, all he could see as he sold his family's race shop, were the countless grueling hours he'd watched his father commit to. They were gone in an instant. The foundation granted to him that had given him a shot at his dream, it was fading away. Like the Edmund Fitzgerald set out to sea, K Automotive was gone, and the Keselowskis had nothing to show for it but empty cups.
All I see is a bunch of empty cups.
For many, this would have been the end of it. They'd had packed their bags, tucked their tail between their legs, and sulked for the rest of their lives. For Brad, however, this was the turning point, the moment he swore to never let another opportunity go, to count on no one else, to let no one else stand in opposition to his dream. He wasn't simply going to recover his family legacy, he was going to rewrite history itself. Starting 2007, through goodwill and hard work, Brad has been given one last shot with an underfunded backmarker team by the name of Keith Coleman Racing. There isn't much to say about them, a legacy of middling results and an overall truly forgettable presence. Reflectively looking back on Brad's results in the first half of 2007, you'd be hard-pressed to understand what stood out. A pile of 30s and 40s with a highlight 25th or 2 sprinkled in. If folks had looked away, if ever so briefly from these races, just looked at the results tabs, not been in tune with every waking minute of racing action, the Keselowskis would have been forgotten. Their legacy, that of failure, a shattered family, and one of the greatest minds in modern NASCAR erased. You see, what for others seemed impossible, for a few was easy. For folks like Dale Earnhardt Jr., Todd Bodine, and Mark Martin, what they saw was heart. They saw 50-plus years of blood, sweat, and tears, a family dynasty in peril every time Brad stepped behind the wheel of a car. He fought for every inch, he gave it everything he had, and carried the burden of his family's future on his shoulders. All of the pain, anguish, and heartache channeled into an unbreakable spirit and mind capable of weathering any storm. His future was calling. All he needed was a chance to answer the phone. The NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series is racing under the lights of Memphis, Tennessee. Just days earlier, the championship contender Ted Musgrave had tangled with Kelly Byers at Milwaukee and been suspended by NASCAR for his actions. In his place stepped a young man ready to hit the fourth quarter buzzer beater. At the recommendation of those who had battled against him on track, Brad had been selected to drive a quality piece of machinery for the first time in his career. Stepping out into the court, pulling back, and tossing up a potentially career-sealing basket. With only 10 laps to go, Brad has made the move stick and he's leading on a one-groove racetrack. Today, he's proven to the world that he was worthy of being here and worthy of this chance. That his family legacy will not be forgotten so easily if only he could just finish out these last 10 laps without...
And he's spinning on the racetrack. The 9 is around. Contact with the 6.
Travis Quapple got up behind him. We saw the sheet metal get bent.
The funniest thing happens to us in our lowest moments. It feels as if the entire world is collapsing around us, blinding us to all sunlight. I have to imagine that for Brad at that moment, he had to have thought he fumbled the bag again. He had blown yet another chance. Whether that be his fault or not, he hadn't done enough to win and was going to be forgotten. However, for someone watching at his couch at home, it was all he ever needed to see. Even though the ball didn't go through the basket, he wanted him on his side of the court. Fast forward to 2008, and Brad has been given the chance of a lifetime to drive for NASCAR's most popular driver, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and seek out a path to Cup. At the time, almost no Nationwide Series regulars competed for wins. I mean, for goodness sake, outside of standalone events, only one regular had won since 2005. For Brad, though, racing against Cup guys wasn't a challenge, but an opportunity to engage his greatest weapon, one that will wield him to greatness: his mind. Maybe taking inspiration from the likes of Earnhardt Sr., or simply echoing their trauma-built mentality, Brad Keselowski started playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. Week after week, Brad would engage in the dark arts of psychological warfare. A little nudge here, holding on your right rear fender there, quipping remark, an ego-striking comment, and a callous smirk to finish it off. Brad was beginning to occupy the minds of his competitors, and the first to fall would be Denny Hamlin. And I'm sure there were many more moments of contention prior to this, but for our sake, our story began on a warm summer evening in NASCAR's backyard. A couple years prior, Charlotte Motor Speedway repaved, and ever since, it's been treachery. Simple practice laps are now white-knuckle experiences. Qualifying laps have become some of the most heart-wrenching on the calendar. Maybe it's under this overwhelming stress that Denny Hamlin's mind had already begun to crack. Or maybe it's just that cocky smile. Regardless, as the laps wind down, the fuse breaks, and rivalry number 1 has begun.
I had him cleared except for maybe 2 inches. Instead, he hangs on my right rear quarter and then goes in the corner right on my door. And that pisses drivers off.
He doesn't like when guys race him hard.
He came from the bottom all the way to the top and cut our nose off just to block us, and we just don't roll like that.
He decided to take my left front fender off.
So I retaliated. So you throw a rock, I'm gonna throw a concrete block back.
Jump ahead almost a full year, and Brad has established himself as the greatest Busch/Nationwide driver the past 3 years, taking it to the quote-unquote bushwhacker Cup drivers week in and week out, grabbing his first win at Nashville in the summer of '08 and following it up with a win at Bristol that fall. A race that saw a cheerful 8-year-old witness his first ever NASCAR race. But enough about me. Back to Brad. Seeing this phenomenal turn of pace, NASCAR's Grand Emperor Rick Hendrick has turned his graces on the young Keselowski. He has verbally agreed that if all remains as is, to place him in Rick's number 5 Cup car heading into the 2010 season. All Brad had to do is keep up the pace, and soon enough, he'd be racing with GoDaddy.com sponsorship for one of NASCAR's greatest organizations. You know, there are brief moments of weakness where I almost feel as if trying to escape poverty in America is rigged. That no matter how hard you try, it's all for naught. The company you work for closes, and the boss who looks favorably upon you gets let go, and the rent jumps $200. All of those sacrifices you've made to stretch your income have been wiped out, and you stand right back where you started. A little more tired and a little bit more bitter than you were before. For Brad Keselowski, no stranger to the bottom, it appeared that all of those questions pondering his future were behind him. He was the heir to the Hendrick kingdom, and all was looking up. Right up until...
Good job, Mark.
A moment of jubilation for the sport as one of its bridesmaids is getting one last shot at finally becoming the bride. Mark Martin, at age 50, had just won his first race since 2005 and is making a bid in an elusive first championship. For 99.9% of people, when Mark crossed the line, a winner at last, they were filled with joy. For that 0.1%, however, that was Brad. Stomach in his feet as he knew his shot at driving for one of NASCAR's best teams had just been erased. However, as we've learned so far, Brad is not like you and me. He's been forged in the fires of Michigan winters, and what would have been soul-crushing for some is just another chance to prove history wrong. Another beautiful spring day in Alabama, NASCAR was witnessing the true birth of what would become known as tandem racing. Theorized and executed before, today its effects were on full display. As the laps wind down, the sport's favorite son is broken away from the pack with Rocket Man Ryan Newman. This race will come down to the pair of them, and given the circumstances, Dale Jr. looks to be in the perfect place to slingshot his way to a victory. But what he wasn't counting on was his young protege using those Junior Motorsports office lessons to catapult himself in a prime position to win his first ever Cup race. This all just 1 week removed from his dreams of a Hendrick seat going up in smoke. All that stands in his way is last year's winningest driver, Carl Edwards, in about 1 mile. Flashbacks to the sweaty night in Memphis fill his mind, the forgotten handshake agreement of Rick Hendrick rounding this final corner, and almost surreal vision of Michigan fills his mind. The day he stood outside of K Automotive having sold what was left of his father's legacy for scraps. The ball was back in his hands, the basket just out of reach, if only he could just...
No, he turns it! No! Brad Keselowski won this race.
Just like that, Brad Keselowski was a NASCAR Cup Series race winner. All of those sleepless nights, the dreams of his grandfather paid off. Talladega Victory Lane, oh, what a sweet sight it was. However, some 200 yards away from his jubilation lay the wreckage of Carl Edwards' number 99 Ford Fusion. Walking off in a joking fashion, it appeared that Carl owned up to the wreck, that these two had no qualms. However, in reality, rivalry number 2 had just begun. Almost emboldened by this run of form, Brad enters back into his day job, driving for Dale Earnhardt Jr. in the second-tier Nationwide Series. In the middle of an otherwise meaningless stretch of laps, Brad shoves his nose into a non-existent gap and turns Denny Hamlin around. The same man he had started beef with just over a year ago at Charlotte, now lying backwards in Delaware. To almost rub salt in the wound, Brad would take this stolen track position and turn it into a podium finish, making continual statements to the Cup Series garage that if they wanted to win, they were going to want him. For now, however, it was media time, and for one Denny Hamlin, the kettle was beginning to boil over.
Listen to that idiot talk. He has no idea how to race.
He just tried to take advantage of me, and I'm not going to be pushed around.
That's why, he'll get a ride and he'll hang around for a couple of years and people will realize that he's not really that good.
He tried to take advantage of me, and I had to make a decision of whether to let him or not, and the rest is history.
He'll realize that in his younger years, he didn't do it the right way.
He had the choice, and he knew I was there.
It was on this very asphalt that bad Brad Keselowski was born just 2 years ago. The alter ego of a mind so heartbroken, so tormented that all moralistic grandeur had faded. Today would be that alter ego's coming out party.
Like Brad Keselowski really had a lot of speed getting out of the turn. Carl gets tapped from behind.
You ever get cut off in traffic? Maybe someone stops just inches from your turnoff for no apparent reason. Wasting your time, striking your ego, stringing expletive-riddled syllables together in a tapestry of beauty. I wonder what our friend Cousin Carl is saying right here, right now. Guess we'll never know.
Look out, could get hit. He gets Allgaier.
As for our protagonist, Brad Keselowski, it should come as no surprise that after introducing his competition to Tony Hawk 360s all day, he won, and to boot, an extra check courtesy of Nationwide. What a great day! A win, a fat bag, and a field full of drivers all pondering his demise. 2 weeks go by and we find ourselves surrounded by cactus and a suffocating lack of humidity. Down on the track, however, we can at least find one source of moisture.
Oh, he gets into Hamlin. Go low, come on, go low.
Denny Hamlin's kettle had finally boiled over, and it's in this moment that Brad's mastermind play kicked into action, spinning the, at the time, fairly clean racing Denny Hamlin in a strategic display of dominance. Brad has triggered the irrational. Denny Hamlin swears it to the world that this young Keselowski will face retribution, that his actions will indeed have consequences.
There's a lot of guys that owe him, and I'm just going to be the first of the pay window. No, I'll take care of him. It's no biggie.
In the minds of folks like you and me, folks like Hamlin, moralistically gray tactics like this seem like a surefire way to failure. To anger everyone around you, to have every man, woman, and child at your throat, it's just so off-putting. We are social creatures, and the opinions of others bear impact on our survival for most of human history. However, we aren't in the fields. We're behind the wheel, a 2-ton tame metallic explosion, and the laws of the common are replaced with octane. You see, driving race cars isn't a physical or social experience. It's a demoralizingly solo affair. It's just you, your mind, and the machine you wield. So it's under this lens that Brad's vision finally comes into view. If you can invade the minds of your opponents to have them not only fear you, but enraged by you, then you'd have the upper hand. Blinded by this fury, your competitors will form a conga line, tripping over themselves, devising your demise. Tenths will slip away, right front tires turn to ash, right rear tires molten into the concrete, and you'll be driving away.
Keselowski's around.
Whoa!
Right off the front bumper of Denny Hamlin.
This is why in a moment that most would see consequences, I see victory, as Brad Keselowski's number 88 GoDaddy.com Chevy applies for a job at Krispy Kreme on the front stretch of Miami. You can almost hear the laughter emanating from within the cockpit.
That was fun. Give me 4 tires, I'll be all right.
Brad knows that from here forward, he's won the war on Denny Hamlin's mind.
I got a feeling when he wakes up in the morning that he's not going to feel any better about himself. He's got a lot of problems and on and off the racetrack, and I don't think spinning me is going to make him happy.
I feel great right now. It was well worth it. We'll never be even. Yeah, it's going to be other days where we're going to be racing, and he's still going to think about it when I'm in his rearview mirror.
Next up, a familiar foe. For the 2010 season, Brad Keselowski will finally become one of the eternal, a full-time NASCAR Cup Series driver for Roger Penske. Where Hendrick saw question marks, Mr. Penske saw greatness. To take one of the worst performing cars in their fleet and turn it around would be no small task, but one young Keselowski is up for. Entering the 4th race of the season, and Brad is doing what years of drivers before him couldn't, taking the number 12 car and running well with it. Closing laps, and he's placed himself in a fantastic position to earn a top 5 finish. In typical Keselowski fashion, though, he's had a few run-ins along the way. Earlier in the race, he stuffed his nose into a closing gap and wrecked an excited Carl Edwards. Donning the colors of his first heroic win some 5 years earlier, Carl was looking to cement this design in the mind of fans, and he would wind up accomplishing just that. But not in the way he would have hoped.
And the 99 has turned over Brad Keselowski. And we have a caution.
For Brad, while scary, this was yet another moment of victory on his quest to invade the mind of his competitors. Carl now second-guessing himself. Should he have done that? Was it over the line? How do you think this will impact his outward image? What do his sponsors think? Carl was reeling, and Brad was reaping all the benefits.
He's losing his mind. And I'm reaping all the benefits.
It's a hot summer night in Illinois. Just over the river, the Gateway Arch looms tall on the horizon. The gateway to the west will be the gateway to finally unraveling Cousin Carl's unshakably good public image. A war was coming to a close, and Keselowski knew exactly how to drive a Missouri native mad. Distastefully rob him of hometown glory with a meticulous nudge, walk him up the track against his will, and let the sparks fly.
Whoa! Touch! He spun out!
Now look, I'm a die-hard Carl Edwards fan, and I can remember my 10-year-old body leaping for joy as Keselowski careened into the inside wall. For as much as Brad waged war on Carl's mind, he had waged war on my own. Nothing filled me with more rage than seeing that pesky smirk in victory lane, throwing couch ornaments across the room as his car crossed the start-finish line with a field at his rears. It's why, after all these years, I'm able to place myself in the shoes of Edwards and Hamlin. The way he raced was downright unfair, it was immoral, it was distasteful, it was grotesque. All words said many moons ago about another young star, that of NASCAR's greatest, Dale Earnhardt. Their methods unorthodox and off-putting, yet calculatingly brilliant. To this day, no one remembers that dastardly nudge Brad gave Carl into turn 1. All they remember is this.
He ain't gonna kill my boy. I'm sick and tired of this. I'll get my own damn uniform back out and take care of this.
I'll defend Carl to my dying days, but you have to admit that if you're trying to unravel the conscience of your rivals, this is exactly how you'd script it up. Up until this point, Brad might have been popular amongst Earnhardt loyalists, but he hadn't won over the masses. For that, he'd have to do something big, something the media would amplify, something that would grab headlines regardless of the outcome. What he needed was a soundbite. A chorus of boos from the fans in Bristol, Tennessee could only mean one thing. Kyle Rowdy Busch has entered the building, and he'd like nothing more than to send every single one of these fans home with a frown. Years earlier, he'd become public enemy number 1 by wrecking Redneck Jesus Dale Earnhardt Jr. in Richmond. Tonight, he looks to continue an unfathomably dastardly dream, to ruin the entire week of racing for these Bristol fans to win every single race contested this week. He's off to a bang with the win of the Truck Series last night, and here today, he's leading late with a shot at getting 33% closer to the record books. His Cup car was on rails in practice, and it seems that if only he can lock up tonight's victory, the history will belong to him, and him alone as NASCAR's first ever triple-header champion. At this moment, 2 options were presented to our protagonist. Simply wreck Kyle, win the day, or sacrifice tonight to become legend.
And he takes the position back. Uh-oh, Kyle, will he retaliate? Yes, he turns him.
Hold on. Brad Keselowski, driver of the Penske Racing Dodge. Kyle Busch is an ass.
Sidebar before I continue, can I just say thank you to Kyle Busch for easily being the most amusing driver in recent memory? Dude is a factory for racing memes.
If he fixes how to drive this place, he'd be right there with me. I know. Well, I got because it was going to be some big deal in the media.
As for our story, it's clear in this moment that Brad has racked up victory number 3 against his rivals. 3 of the largest obstacles en route to him becoming a NASCAR champion had been vanquished. Now his sights were set on what seemed impossible for the past 5 seasons, to finally upend ice-veined 5-time champion, Jimmie Johnson. To unearth the man who had won 5 championships in a row would take a new approach. Simply rattling his cage from time to time wouldn't be enough. For this, they'd have to systematically chip away at Team 48's perspective, to metaphorically rob them of their greatest mental weapon, the golden horseshoe.
They have a golden horseshoe stuck up, so.
Jack Knaus and Jimmie Johnson had paired together to have every team in the garage envious, continuously getting every strategy call in their favor, every caution, every setup change, every rules change. I mean, even the riled weather obeyed their demands. While everyone else sought to beat Team 48 on pace, Brad Keselowski and Paul Wolfe, his crew chief, knew to defeat Goliath, you'd have to aim for the mind. To become champion meant to beat Team 48 at their own game and become NASCAR's new Golden Horseshoe owners. And now starting this endeavor would take some time, so entering the 2011 season, Brad and his new digs would forego challenging Jimmie and instead lay the groundwork for their master plan. Winning their first race together on a fuel mileage call and steadily pushing the rules in their favor. Breaking their metallic chariot in a warped disgrace, the Aero mind games had begun and Team 48 was starting to question their direction. All Brad needed now was one final blow to Jimmie's perspective, to replace Jimmie as NASCAR's invincible man. Enter a test session at Road Atlanta, and driving into the dangerously fast Turn 1, Brad's throttle would hang, forcing the young star into the wall at what had to be well over 150 miles an hour. All of this happening directly in front of Jimmie Johnson. Jimmie would run to Brad's side, help him out of the car, finding Brad's foot broken, an injury that would sideline anyone but the toughest SOB this side of the Atlantic. Just days later, Brad would be in victory lane at Pocono, and Jimmie knew. Okay, look, I've posited a lot of happenstance as intentional throughout this video, but I can't bring myself to insinuate that Brad intentionally injured himself to rattle Jimmie's mind or something. That's clearly not what happened, but the impact of this moment was nonetheless felt. Entering the 2012 season, Jimmie wasn't looking at Kyle Busch, Denny Hamlin, or Carl Edwards as his greatest threats. No, he was looking over his shoulder at the rapidly approaching Blue Deuce. Grabbing victories early on at Bristol, Talladega, and Kentucky, Brad established himself as a threat to Jimmie Johnson's presumed throne. However, they weren't favorites, showing occasional pace but never continual domination. Having stolen Team 48's Golden Horseshoe, Brad would need one final item. To beat Jimmie Johnson and Chad Knaus, Brad and Paul Wolfe would need to hijack the final of Team 48's tricks, the playoff sandbag. Throughout the past 6 years, it's become abundantly clear that Jimmie Johnson spends most of the season faffing about, trying ideas, and lulling his competition into a false sense of security. Come the first race of the playoffs, the 48 would suddenly be 3/10 quicker than the field, having deployed their roster of aeromechanical and strategic sorcery. So how would the 2012 playoffs get started?
Win of the season, chase win #1, Chicagoland to Brad Keselowski. Play the strategy just right and get another win in 2012. Brad Keselowski wins it.
That's right, for the first time in recent memory, Jimmie Johnson was going to have to fight from behind and have to chase down Keselowski. The two team had finally shown the garage how to rattle Jimmie Johnson, entering the second to last race of the season, and Jimmie Johnson is starting to crack. The previous week, Jimmie and Brad had gone to war on each other, bouncing off each other at 200 miles an hour. While Johnson had come out on top, taking the win and would appear to be an insurmountable championship lead. If you look in the eyes of Keselowski, you can almost see that he knew that Jimmie Johnson was at his wits' end. Johnson's house had been invaded in his sleep, and when he awoke, the Philosopher's Stone to his sorcery was gone, and it was in the hands of a hard Midwestern blue-collar dreamer. After forging a legacy of sacrifice and failure, the Keselowskis were one step away from reaching Everest. All they ever needed was one final nudge.
48 is into the wall, Vince. Jimmie Johnson has hit the wall. And the checkered flag at a NASCAR Sprint Cup Championship for Penske Racing and Michigan's Brad Keselowski.
Did it, boys. We did it. Great job. What an awesome season.
Thank you for coming along on this journey. I hope this story gives you a great appreciation for Brad, and that when you watch this year's Daytona 500 on Fox, 2:30 p.m., wink wink nudge nudge, that you'll cheer for that number 6 car to add one final jewel to a crown forged in the mind of NASCAR's greatest psychological soldier.